When it comes to our doubles regulators, there's some best practices with routing and hose lengths that we want to make sure that we follow to have the most efficient and streamlined setup that we can. I'm going to talk about some general concepts with setting this up and then get into specifics of hose routings and hose lengths for both fifth port and non-fifth port regulators. To start with our doubles setup, we have our right post. It's going to be on our right when we're wearing the doubles. We have our isolator and we have our left post. Our first important concept is that everything is routed internally. There's nothing out of these first stages that's sticking up, and there's nothing that's sticking out. Our second important concept is that all the hose lengths are optimized and there's no excess. It's a little hard to visualize here since I'm not wearing it, but an example is this low pressure inflator hose. It's exactly the length that it needs to be without any excess that's bowing out or coming out of these bands here. So let's start with the right post. We have a 7-foot long hose routed down and inside the wing. Right now, since we're not using it, it's coiled up. Now, the purpose of this long hose is to facilitate a single file air share through a restriction, whether that's a hatch in a shipwreck or a restriction in a cave. That's the purpose of this long hose, is that single file restriction gas sharing. Anytime that we're in overhead environments where we may have to exit single file, whether that's through restriction or just on a line, the 7-foot long hose needs to be part of our kit. Anything shorter than 7 feet, like a 5-foot hose or a 40-inch hose, is not going to facilitate that single file gas sharing situation. There may be some situations where we're open water diving with no overhead and we could opt for a shorter hose, but the 7-foot long hose is the standard for technical diving because of that single file exit. And the second thing that we have coming off of our right post is this low pressure inflator hose that feeds the wing. Typically something that's between 18 and 22 inches is going to be what we need right here. And there's a little variability there based on the length of this low pressure hose, as well as whether or not we're using a fifth port regulator or a non-fifth port regulator. You can think of the right post as your active regulator. So we're breathing off of the long hose throughout the dive, and then we're using this low pressure inflator hose to control the gas that's in our BC. So the right post regulator is working the whole dive. Our left post has our backup second stage, which is a necklaced short hose regulator. Now, we want this to sit right below our chin on top of our chest. Typically that means an 18 to 22 inch hose here, and then a bungee necklace that keeps it up high. We want to make sure that this regulator is accessible and comfortable to breathe off of. We should be able to switch to this and look around comfortably to end our dive if we had a failure with the right side or we had to share gas. Now, a hose length between 18 and 22 inches is going to get captured by the doubles, so we don't have any excess going out past our shoulders, and that's the ideal setup for this short hose. Adding things like swivels or elbows here, it's just going to complicate things, make more failure points, and actually make the routing harder. So this simple routing right here, going behind our head and to our chin, is what we're looking for. Make sure that the regulator isn't dangling down too low, where it could cause interference with other equipment or be harder to find. And the typical causes of that are a necklace that's too long or a hose that's too long. Next up on the left post is our SPG. So our submersible pressure gauge should be clipped to our left hip, and we want between 24 and 26 inches on this hose here, where we can comfortably read it after we unclip it. Securing this SPG anywhere except for our left hip, especially anywhere where we're crossing our body, is totally inappropriate because it's going to increase the chances of that long hose getting trapped. So a nice short SPG hose here with the clip that's secured right there. When it comes to the SPG, this simple gauge is all that we need. All right, we don't need a console or anything like that. This allows us to check our pressure, and that gets us the data point that we want. Some people are tempted to put another pressure gauge on the right side or a transmitter, something like that, so they have redundancy. But with our doubles, we should think of these as one big tank because this isolator makes them the same. So we only need one pressure gauge. Adding another pressure gauge to the right side seems like it's redundancy, but actually it's just increasing a very common failure point, which is the high pressure swivel here. We don't want to double up on failure points unless they provide extra value, and adding a pressure gauge to the right side doesn't provide any extra value. If we need to isolate the tanks in an emergency situation, then we're leaving. And the pressure that's in the right cylinder is no consequence to us if we've done our gas planning correctly. Transmitters have become a lot more reliable. They offer a lot of utility with a single data source on your wrist. You don't have to unclip an SPG to check your gas. If you're thinking about a transmitter, just go ahead and replace the SPG with a transmitter. The reliability of a transmitter versus the reliability of high pressure spools as far as failure goes is about equal. So if you're going to switch to a transmitter, just switch. Don't double up on failure points. Make sure that you've got extra transmitter batteries in your Save a Dive kit, because that can fail and then you're left without an SPG. And last up on the list is your Drysuit hose, or in this case, a rebreather hose. Now, we're looking for something between 24 and 31 inches, and we don't want a lot of excess with this. We'll route it underneath our left shoulder strap directly into the Drysuit. So that's the basics of hose links and routing with our right and our left post. Another important thing to consider is our long hose routing. So a trap long hose is useless. That's dangerous because we expect to be able to share gas single file, and if it's trapped, we can't do that. That means the long hose needs to be put on last thing, so it's on top of everything else. And the bottom right portion of the long hose, as it comes down the inside of the wing, needs to catch on something. That something could be a canister light, it could be a knife, it could be a pair of shears, or it could even be a mock canister stick. Whatever we use to catch the long hose at this point right here is going to allow us to eat up that slack so it can route very easily around our head and into our mouth. Using a right side waist strap retainer allows us to check the long hose and replace it by ourselves. And that's far superior to something like putting it through bungees behind the back plate and stuffing it in there. It's very difficult, most of the time it's impossible to re-stuff that yourself, which means if you decide to check with your buddy to ensure that it's free and not kinked at the start of the dive, your buddy would have to stuff it for you. Some people shove the long hose underneath their waistband and along their thigh, and that's what helps retain it close to them as they wrap it. If that's your only option, that's your only option, but I would encourage you to look at a knife, shears, a canister light, or a mock canister stick to secure that long hose on your right side instead. Fifth port hose routing makes things a lot easier. And when I say fifth port, I mean a regulator that has a port coming out of the top as well as on the sides. Now the big advantage here is we can route hoses straight, and it prevents kinking and reduces wear on those hoses. The other big benefit that we get out of turret fifth port style regulators is when we go to shear gas, we can reach back and flip this up. If we're in a single file, that gives us a little more length. Most importantly, it prevents the chance of a kink. If we don't have turrets and fifth ports, and we have standard regulators like these FT1s, we still want to stick to the basic concepts of routing internally and having optimized hose lengths. So you can see here, there's no port on this side or that side. The low pressure inflator is routed down and plugged in there. The short hose is routed down and comes around our neck. And we don't have any hoses coming out to the sides. We're tempted with regs like these to turn them sideways. And that's going to be really hard to optimize because we're going to have hoses coming out behind our head this way and that way. And being streamlined and tucked in like this will be pretty much impossible. The downside to this kind of routing is these hard bends here in these hoses, and that's why it's important to have the right length hose to make things work without putting too much strain here or having too much excess. Sometimes people are tempted to put elbows and swivels on these first stages in this kind of configuration to optimize the hose routing a little bit. Those tools will absolutely reduce these hard bends and make things easier on the hoses. The problem with adding swivels and elbows to our first stages is there are more O-rings and more failure points. It's also very rare for those elbows and fittings to have any kind of testing data. So they may offer resistance in breathing that causes regulators to perform below manufacturer specifications. If you want really optimized hose routings, don't try to turn regulators into something they're not. Just get fifth port turret regs and you'll have a more optimized hose routing experience, or just settle for this, which is totally fine. So that's a quick review of regulators for doubles. I've gone over standard hose lengths here, standard routing practices, and remember this whole concept of keeping everything internal and also optimizing those hose lengths for you and your setup to ensure that you don't have any excess, but everything is still usable and accessible. If you want more detailed instructions on using doubles, then you should look at an Intro to Tech class or working with a technical diving mentor. And if you've got questions about that, feel free to give me a holler. And thank you for watching.